I really want to thank my wife. It's impossible to imagine how important she is to the development of any kind of idea that I come up with, the development and the refinement of it. So I'm incredibly grateful. We just had our 33-year wedding anniversary. I'd also like to welcome all the microbiome in the room. Thank you for coming. Okay. So to start with, exactly what is microbiome? Each of us has an abundant menagerie of microorganisms that live both on and in us, collectively known as the microbiota or microbiome. For us, it's comprised of, on the top left, bacteria, fungi, next to it on the right, archaea, protists, and viruses. Those are the classic components of our microbiome. And where do these organisms live? Basically, everywhere. Any part of your body that comes into contact with the outside world. Your skin, your gastrointestinal tract through its entirety, your urinary tract, your respiratory tract, your reproductive system, all come in contact with the outside world and have microbiota. How big are they? They're really minuscule, because if you were to take one of my hairs, you could line up 12 on it on the width of a human hair. On the head of a pin, not the pin its point, but on the head of the pin, this one fabulous author talked about how you could have 1 million dancing on the head of a pin. So these are really infinitely small. How many of them do we have? This is incredible. About 39 trillion. Oh my God. About 39 trillion. And because our bodies have about 30 trillion cells, that means that our body's cells are outnumbered by microbiota, about 1.3 to 1. If you look on the internet, there are some old pieces of data that say there's 10 times as many cells in microflora, but the most accurate, I think, commonly accepted by research is about 1.3 to 1. 10 to 1 is an exaggeration. One way of looking at it is that there's more cells of bacteria in your gut than there are stars in the Milky Way. But regardless of what number you accept, 10 to 1 or 1.3 to 1, we're incredibly genetically outnumbered, just incredibly. Our body has about 20,000 genes, and the microbiome has 500 times more than that, 500 times more than that of genetic material. But it's the same ones throughout the body, right? No. Our body is essentially like an archipelago, a chain of islands, and each part of our body has its own distinct microbiome, just as each one of the Galapagos Islands has its own distinct tortoises and finches. So it's unique in every single part of the body. An interesting way of looking at it is if you think of your own right forearm and your own mouth, the bacteria on your right forearm are closer to the bacteria on my right forearm than to those in your mouth, because it's that distinct in different parts of the body. And this is the one data that just shocked me. Your left hand and right hand share only about 1/6 of the same species, because you pick your nose with one hand. But then beyond that, each one of us is incredibly unique. Each one of us is like our own zoo, depending upon our own experiences with who we contacted, where we live, the kinds of foods we've eaten, the kind of drugs we've taken, all make us into our own unique zoo. How do we get the microflora? If you read almost any article and even almost any really good book, there's this delightful myth out there, I think it's a male myth, that basically you're born completely sterile. That's the same kind of myth that led doctors in the 50s to tell my mother that she could drink alcohol, because the womb is a separate, independent, isolated unit. And there's data that's coming out clearly in the past few years that says that microflora is likely coming in through the umbilical cord. But regardless, but again, if you look at any site or any book will almost always say we're born sterile, but there are studies that contradict that. Look at the title of that one, the picture. That's breast milk bacteria. Once you're born, your microbiome goes through rapid expansion, picking up things from the food you eat, the breast milk, the environment itself. And it typically is thought to take about 1 to 3 years for the microbiome to go from newborn state to adult state. What ultimately shapes your microbiome is a lot of factors: your genetics, where you live, the foods you eat, the animals in your lives. There's this myth sometimes that people that have pets, that their pets are just totally sterile. No, they're not. We're not sterile. And when your pet comes up to you and then goes over to your spouse and then goes over to your kid, guess what they're doing? They're establishing homogeneity within the family unit. Did you catch that? They're taking my microflora and saying, here, give it to the spouse and give it to the child, and everyone starts to have the same microflora. So the animals in your lives, the pesticides, so that when you eat foods that aren't totally organic, which, how's that possible, eat totally organic? But if you eat inorganic foods a lot, which sometimes it's just too expensive to eat organic, what you're essentially doing is you're taking a chemical into your digestive tract that once it gets down to the large intestine is experienced as a poison to the microflora. Does that make sense? This is you're ingesting something that's almost like it's designed to kill organisms, and you're taking that into your mouth, and when it gets down there, that's what it's like. So what do these creatures do? Tons of things. They help us digest food. They produce vitamins and minerals that we wouldn't have access to otherwise. They help us break down toxins. They block out bad microbes. They guide the construction and repair of the body, and they do one other minor thing. Just want to make sure to mention it. They can turn our genes on and off. What did he just say? They can turn our genes on and off. Study after study show this. They behave like a hidden organ, as important as an eye or a stomach, but instead of made up of a solid mass, they're made up of trillions of swarming cells. And if you're OCD, and I can make this comment because I used to have horrible OCD, if you get really OCD and go, oh, let's just get rid of all of them, they're so disgusting. Just no microorganisms, it'd be so much better, we'd all be dead. All grazing animals would die because they couldn't digest what they eat. All crop plants would fail because there wouldn't be the protection from the microorganisms against insect invasion, and the entire food chain would collapse. I never heard this one before studying for this talk. Microbes even help seed rain clouds to produce rain. There are bad microbes. Ebola, plague, tuberculosis, Lyme's. There are bad microbes. And these kinds of microorganisms have really profoundly affected human existence on the planet, but unfortunately they've entirely shaped the general population view of what microbe means. That there's something really dangerous and horrible to be avoided at all costs. And check out these numbers. There's literally only about 100 kinds of bacteria on the planet that cause disease. And there are thousands of different kinds in your gut that help you live, that make living possible. They're not threats, they're guardians of life. The truth is that microbes matter. We feared them, ignored them, detested them, hated them and we need to appreciate them. So today's talk, first, what's the nature of our independent relationship with microbes? Then there's the strategy that I've come up for working with them, the technique itself, then demonstrating it, and then having us practice it. So as far as the I that is we, where are we going? A little bit of a talk about our interdependence with microbes, how microbes actually can be traumatized, how trauma is often intergenerational and not just within our own lives, how microbiomes are intergenerational and not just within our own lives, and then some case examples that tie together what I'm presenting. So, this is a great book, Ed Young's book on I Contain Multitudes. But what he says is that when you think, and I'm going to change it a little bit, but when you think of someone you care about, or you think about yourself, oftentimes you might think something like this, that you're a soul or a consciousness walking through life trying to direct this body to have the best experience possible. So there's a consciousness, perhaps a brain and a body, and there's an interrelationship between those two. And this is basically just a fallacy. It's not that simple. That's a fiction. We're not what we think we are. We never were. Scientists now view each one of us as a biomolecular network, as a host body, perhaps if you're spiritually oriented, a consciousness, and microorganisms that all live together. A biomolecular network, a biological unit. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that I, as a consciousness, Lee, and 39 trillion microbes live in this body. And it's our life. It's not just my life. It's our life that we're living. It's our body and our life. Interesting quote, when we eat, so do they. When we go on a trip, they come along with us. And when the body dies, they eat it. We live in symbiosis, a wonderful term that refers to different organisms and perhaps different consciousness living together. It's a cooperative experience, this life we've been living, even though we never knew. It's always a we and never a me. It's a shared experience, this life that we're living. So how does microbiota, what does it possibly have to do with trauma? And the fact is it can have incredible things to do with trauma. The study that started all of this massive research that's been going on over the last many years was a study done in 2004 in Japan. And what they did is they studied mice that were raised germ-free. And what germ-free means is that if you wanted to be really OCD and not have any microbes, you'd have to live in an isolated chamber. But if you raised a mice like that, and there's no microbes at all, what they found was that those mice that were raised germ-free produced twice the stress hormones as a regular mouse when they were challenged. What this is saying, if you didn't have microbes, then you'd have twice as many stress hormones produced than you would otherwise if you were challenged. So this really kicked it all off. And there's been so many studies of animals since then. This was an interesting one by Christopher Lowry at the University of Bristol. And what he did is he just took one bacteria, a positive bacteria, M. vaccae, and injected it into mice. Then he challenged those mice versus a control group. And what he said was, it was as if the mice that had the M. vaccae were on antidepressants. They had so much less stress response just by being injected with one bacteria. One of the most brilliant researchers in the world, in my opinion, is John Cryan at Cork University in Ireland. And notice this quote, early life stress produces a change in the microbiome of an animal. And notice the last thing, and a signature of that persists throughout the animal's life. It doesn't quite make sense, right? You'd think when the trauma's over that the microbiome would rebound back, but a signature of that or an aspect of trauma persists in the microbiome. And again, for those that want to be OCD, be careful. Animals that are raised germ-free have clear deficits in social behaviors. It's not better to not have microbes. And then there's just some of the studies on humans. If you take a patient that goes into ICU from a car accident, from a bad fall, from some major, physical trauma, within 72 hours, their microbiome starts to change from the trauma. If you look at patients with traumatic brain injury, what this sets up is a change in the gut microbiome, which sets up a pro-inflammatory state. What does that mean? A state of inflammation throughout the central nervous system, which suggests what or creates what? More trauma. So a brain injury affects the gut microbiome, and that sets up a pro-inflammatory state throughout the central nervous system. Notice that what I'm suggesting then is that the microbiome is traumatized. It's not just the person that was traumatized or the soul or consciousness, and not just the body, but also the microbiome. Here's a study of people with irritable bowel syndrome and what early life trauma did to their gut microbiome. And what it showed was that not only that early trauma altered the gut microbiome, but the changes in the gut microbiome did not resolve when the trauma was over. Notice again, the microbiome is also traumatized. This was a really interesting study of 344 children. A group of them were raised in positive home environments with their parents, and the other group had adverse care experiences in institutions or foster care. And what they were trying to find out was, did having an adverse experience in foster care or institution, did that affect your gastrointestinal experience as well as your anxiety? In the first phase of the study, there was a clearly demonstrated relationship between bad experiences in foster care or institutional situations and gastrointestinal symptoms. So notice what we're saying is that, children are traumatized. But what was also interesting was that within the kids that were traumatized, when you examine their gut microbiome, that was also changed. And that those children had a significant increase in activation in their prefrontal cortex when looking at negative images versus other children. Notice again that the microbiome was traumatized. This was a fascinating study. They took 40 women that were healthy, and they looked at their microbiomes, and they didn't give an exact number in the summary article that I looked at, but a group of the women had a predominance of what are called just bacterioids. It's a certain kind of bacteria. Whereas the other women had a preponderance of Prevotella, a different kind of bacteria. So what's the big deal? What was interesting is that the women that had the greater abundance of bacterioids had a greater thickness in their prefrontal cortex, which is the ability to stay rational when under stress, a greater thickness in their insula, which means less sense of disgust and self-hatred. And there's the thing you've seen if you've done much research on trauma nearly everybody talks about the hippocampus. The women that had a greater preponderance of bacterioids also had a greater thickness in their hippocampus. Now, this isn't saying that the only cause of that is the bacterioids, but there's at least a suggested relationship here. And when stressed out, the women that had the bacterioids had a significantly less stress response than the woman with the Prevotella. Interesting. What does all this mean? It means that microbiome participates in trauma just like we do. The body's traumatized, the soul is traumatized, as well as the microbiome. And then here's some studies that when I was putting together a presentation, it almost was shocking. exposure to antibiotics in the first 6 months of life increases body mass in the first 10 to 38 months of life. And you look at that and you go, well, that's no big deal because after 38 months it goes away. No. There was a study done after that was a meta-analysis of several different studies, and what they found was that each additional exposure to antibiotics increases the risk of childhood obesity by 6%. So one exposure, 6% increase in the rate of childhood obesity, another exposure, 12% total, another exposure, 18%. It's incredible. This was the one that affected me the most. If you look at someone that's healthy and someone that's depressed, there's a difference in their microbiomes. And that is that the microbiome of the depressed people is more limited, less diverse. So what's the big deal? This researcher also at Cork University said, I'm not saying that this is the cause of depression, but I think it's really part of the experience. And to back up that proposal, here's what they did. They took the gut microflora of people that were depressed and injected it into rats. Guess what the mice did? They started to act depressed. That was the change. Injecting this microflora from depressed humans into the rats made the rats act depressed. If you take the microflora of a schizophrenic person and inject it into, was this germ-free? Yes, germ-free mice. What they found is that the mice that are injected with the microflora from a schizophrenic human being, the mouse starts to develop some of the characteristic brainwave distortions that are common to schizophrenic humans. Did you get that? Give the mouse, schizophrenic humans, microflora, and the mouse starts to produce some of the characteristic brain distortions of a schizophrenic human being. This is really incredible. Mice that are hardwired genetically, they're genetically just set up, which is incredibly creepy. They're set up to be very prone to developing Parkinson's. This one study showed that those mice will only develop Parkinson's if they have the right kind of microflora. In other words, an essential ingredient for Parkinson's-prone mouse to get Parkinson's is a Parkinsonian kind of microbiome. And clearly not on a causal level, but there's data coming out that people with dementia also have a significant narrowing of their microbiome. That's not saying that it causes dementia, but it is correlated. Any questions on that? Yes?
When you were talking about the isolated mice, were they isolated from each other as well, or were there several mice that were still in the same cage?
I don't know. So the question that she just asked, when you're looking at germ-free mice, does that mean they're isolated from each other, or are they just the germ-free mice are all kept together? The one thing, I only saw one visual image, so I'm only commenting on that. It was an isolated chamber for that one mouse, but it's a great question. I don't know. Anything else I can't answer? Maybe we should go on. Okay, so what I'm proposing so far is that there's an incredible intimate interrelationship between us and our microbiome, and that microbiome participate in the traumas that we go through. The next thing I'd like to suggest is that trauma, independent of microbiomes, is not just within your own life, but is often intergenerational. Not always, not preponderantly, but is often intergenerational. So here's one of the first studies that you might have heard of where they took some mice and they trained them to be afraid of cherry blossom smell. And obviously, to do that, that's got to be creepy. What they do is they shock the floor of the cage every time they introduce cherry blossom smell into the cage. And eventually the mice start to associate the cherry blossom smell with a shock. And then eventually you can just produce the smell and they get freaked out. And that sounds like classical learning. That sounds like nothing at all. But what was interesting is that the children and grandchildren of those mice had a fear reaction to the smell without ever being trained to fear. In other words, the trauma from the cage being shocked experience was traced down or was passed down to 2 generations of mice. Trippy. What does this mean? What this means to me is that the obsessiveness that sometimes we can have within our search to try to resolve our own trauma, the obsessive trying to focus on what is the event that caused my pain. I'm gonna figure that out. I'm gonna spend years, decades in therapy figuring out exactly why it is that I am as messed up as I am. And there's a problem. Because a lot of times the event that might be causing your pain happened before you were even conceived. Before you were even conceived. To someone you never met. When they trained those mice later on to not be afraid of the smell, then there was no passing down of the fear of the smell. That was also interesting. Then there's some other studies that you may have not heard of. That's the one that's most commonly talked about. This was done by this really brilliant woman at the University of Zurich. And what they did is again, it always sounds incredibly cruel. So you have some mice that are born, and what you do is as soon as they're born, you take them away from their mother to mimic early life trauma that human beings go through. Okay, so what you do is you sit around in a lab and you traumatize the hell out of mice, emotionally and spiritually, great. But then what's interesting is that those mice, when they grow up, start to look like traumatized human beings. They overeat, they're socially averse, and they take excessive risks that are inappropriate. And what was interesting again is that was passed down to the next generation without any being taken away from the mother. Does that make sense? Now, I remember one time when I was giving a talk on a class on trauma, and someone said, that only happens for 3 generations. She's finding that it can go on for 4 or 5 generations at least. I think it can go on much longer than that. But she's finding certain epigenetic signatures that even go on beyond 3 generations. A lot of the studies also are often only on males. What a shock. And I think that sometimes people go, well, it just means that intergenerational trauma is just for men. I don't believe that either. This was a really interesting study. So how could they possibly study Civil War survivors? So here's what they did to study the effects of trauma for prisoners of war from the Civil War. So let's say that this chair symbolizes the time frame of the Civil War, and this person might have been a Southern soldier captured by the North, or vice versa, and had horrible experiences, but you can only imagine how bad it was back then, as a prisoner of war. And what they did in this recent study at University of California, was that they looked at the health records of this person. Hi there. They looked at the health records of this person's children that he conceived before the war and compared it to the health records of the children that he conceived after the war. And the ones that were born before the war had significant lower stroke and cancer rates. And the difference was the trauma during the war. And that trauma was passed on. Really clever study. Another study looked at Holocaust survivors and found, this was a small study, so it's somewhat controversial, that there were epigenetic changes in the genome of children of Holocaust survivors that set them up to have adverse responses to stress versus anybody else. Lower cortisol circulating levels that meant that they were less able to rebound after trauma. Trauma is not just within your life. What's interesting, though, not only are our trauma intergenerational, but so are our microbiomes. Let's look at that. Microbiomes are traumatized, trauma is intergenerational, and now we're going into so are microbiomes. University of California, Berkeley study, really long-term looking, probably at the fecal samples that they found in great apes that died millions of years ago, whatever. And what they found was that the microbiome, if you believe in evolution, has evolved with us as we've transited from ape to human being, that the microbiome has been evolving. And interesting, though, the microbiome has been getting more and more narrow. And that's likely, there's no data on it, but this person was saying that it's likely a cause of some of the diseases and obesity that we're faced with, even mental disorders. So the microbiome is evolving, it's not constant. Now, if you look at it on a much more personal level, once you're a newborn, about 3/4 of your microbiome is directly traced back to your mother. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the family. Thus, whether it came in through the umbilical cord or through the birth canal, you inherit a lot of your fundamental microbiome from your mother. That's not blaming women. That's called life. It's called life. Then beyond that, Dale McFarland at the University of Wisconsin discovered or realized that when you have a lot of social interaction with someone, you start to develop the same microbiome, whether that be through sharing social choices, similar foods you eat, living in similar situations, and or physical contact. Two people start to develop a similar setup of their microflora. It's unique for each person, but they start to homogenize. If you look at and study apes, frequent social contacts within an ape community leads to diversity in your own microbiome and homogeneity within the group. And this was my favorite study. What this guy was saying was, in the study of red-bellied lemurs, was that whether or not you're blood-related or not, if you live in close quarters, like living in a house, whether you're blood-related or not, you're going to start to develop the same microbiome as the other members of the family. In other words, what I'm suggesting, and then he says, synchronized microbiomes help us work together better. That's great if what? It's a healthy family. But what I'm saying is that there's a level where the microbiome in a dysfunctional environment still is part of what holds the family together. There's a cooperation in dysfunction. So that he didn't say that in his study because he was looking at how he felt like it helped the lemurs work together better as a family, but he wasn't looking at an alcoholic bunch of lemurs. Interesting study. 670 people between the ages of 2 and 86. And if you live together, your immune system starts to look like those that you live with, likely in part due to sharing of microflora. So whether it's through physical contact, shared environments, foods, activities, as well as your pets, microbiomes start to participate in the family story. And now time for a word from one of our sponsors. My name's Sam Actinobacteria. I'm part of the Cartwright microbiome. My great ancestors, my great, oh, I won't bore you, it was a long time ago. Back in the 50s, we were born when the body was born, to some extent. Some of us came in through the umbilical cord. But we were around back then in 1954, and we were partiers. We were partiers. Man, we loved those martinis. It was just every night in utero. There were 2 double dry vodka martinis, and it was spectacular. I guess you'd say we were born alcoholic, but we were partiers, however you want to say it. So that when Lee was born and we were born, we were kind of alcoholic and kind of disassociated, and we went through life, kind of going around, being kind of spacey and disoriented, just like Lee was, interestingly enough. And then something not so good happened. Around age 12 or 13, the body started to have, I think it's called zits. And the family was rich enough, unfortunately, to take the body to a dermatologist. The dermatologist suggested tetracycline, a broad spectrum antibiotic. And interestingly enough, it worked on healing the zits for about 10 days. But he continued taking it for 4 years. And after a while, all of us bacteria started to hate each other's guts. Because we were fighting like hell to what? To survive. So this war started to be setting up inside Lee, inside the body. And it was a war between not only each of the different kinds of bacteria, but also between the consciousness and us. Because every one of those tetracycline pills was trying to kill us, intentionally or not. So this set up an interesting state in Lee called yuck. And he was basically, I think the word starts with an M. I think we would have said he was basically miserable then for much of his life after puberty. But he never knew it was partly from the tetracycline. Not all, but partly. And then we were going through life, and then we went on a trip to Mexico, and then all hell broke loose. That was a fundamental part of the experience of my microbiome, was being just beaten every day for 4 years in the hope of having less pimples. Wow. Thank you, Sam. So let's then look at how this might be tied all together. There is an interdependence between us and our microflora. Microflora are traumatized just like we are. Trauma is not just within our own life, it's intergenerational. And so are microbiomes, they're also intergenerational. And here's the Lee theory then, there's no research on this. I feel like microbiomes play an essential part in transmitting, sometimes, trauma through time between family generations. The only way I can really go beyond just saying that's a theory of mine is to talk about some case examples. So every example that I give today is from a combination or a synthesis of several different clients. So I'm not talking about any specific person. Had several people like this. This was really one of the first experiences I ever had with this, and it was really profound. So what I have is, by example, young woman in my life in her early 30s, and her waking life has basically been dominated by anger. And her father was incredibly angry, but he didn't hit anybody, but he was just incredibly angry. And she's tried basically everything that she could to come out of this anger trance that she's in basically all the time, and nothing's ever worked. So, without going to the next slide, what I did was I looked at her face when she was talking. And I noticed that her right eye was just really just like, oh, I just want to kill somebody. Just like, oh, God. Yeah. So being weird like I am, I start to go, okay, what's causing that in the right eye? And I go, are there any neurological reflexes of the eye? Consensual eye, I don't want to bore you with all the little stupid things I look at. Looked at the blood flow to and from the right eye, looked at the different receptors at the back of the right eye, looked at the visual cortex, and there was just nothing there. And I went, oh, I wonder if it's the microflora. Because there is a microbiome of the eye. And I had a sense that it was. So this is literally what you need to get this, because I did not tell this person what I was going to work on. I was trying to be as scientific as possible. So what I did is I had them sit in a chair, and I asked them, can I put my hand, I didn't hold them up like this, but for those of you who are back here, I held her up in the air. Cruel therapy. And I said, can I put my hand lightly above your eye? That's all I did. And I stood there for about 15, 20 minutes talking to her microbiome with the statements that we're going to use in class. Didn't tell her what I was doing. After 20 minutes, I said, how's the anger? She said, I really can't find it anymore. She was looking out through the microflora, the angry microflora of her father. And after just that one 20-minute thing, the anger, she said, was about 75% better. She could hardly even find it. And she came in a few months later, and it held. She was looking out at life through the pissed off microflora of her father. And that was the cause of the anger. Because her right eye was still living where? In the house. And perhaps living where? In his childhood. Isn't that incredible? I did nothing else. Because I didn't read it, there was nothing else to do. Had this experience a few times. Very nice guy comes in, late 40s, a lot of trouble with his weight, and I'm basically useless at helping people control their weight, unfortunately. And he's done gastric bypass surgery, and it helps somewhat, but he's still dominated by this experience. How can I describe it other than there's a voice coming from his gut that says, eat! Just screams, eat, eat. So it's like you pick up a bag of chips, you don't just eat one, once you eat one, it's just like, boom, you might as well just go like this. Because this voice is just like screaming, eat! And the voice has always been there. Just like his mom. It's always been there. After just one session working with his microflora of his small and large intestine, the voice becomes eat, eat. Instead of eat, it was like eat, 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 versus eat. The microflora was traumatized and wanted nothing but to eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. Woman in her early 60s has had free-floating anxiety all her life, has done everything to change it. Nothing much has helped. It's as if the anxiety has a life of its own. Working with the microflora over one session, the anxiety goes from a 10 down to a 3. Just working with microflora. It wasn't that the other kinds of therapy hadn't worked. If you have someone whose microflora is incredibly traumatized and is in one of these spinning vortices, you can do great therapy with them, and if they don't respond, it may look as if nothing has changed. Because a lot of how often does therapy address the microflora? Now, sometimes it just does automatically. You don't always have to work with microflora at all. But one of the things that might be going on with therapy that seems to be really good and should be helping someone, that it's not actually leading to clinical results that would actually improve the person's quality of life, is because the microflora is never addressed. Then it's not always intergenerational. Man comes in, survived skin cancer, had to do surgery and chemotherapy, but survived. But he hasn't felt alive since the chemotherapy. So the chemotherapy saved his life, but took his love of life away. And what he's done is basically exercised, meditated, done acupuncture, done Reiki, done therapy, done everything imaginable. And it still is just like, he's just like flatline, walking around like a zombie. And working with his microbiome over 2 sessions, his love of life came back. Why? Because the microbiome was traumatized by the chemo. Chemo isn't bad. If it helps someone live, that's great. But it can be traumatized as well. Each of these situations involves the microbiome being traumatized, needed to be acknowledged, and in my theory of trauma, it needed to be brought into present time. And the goal of the process that I want to talk to you about today is to try to help bring your microbiome into present time. The goals of it are to feel more congruent, to feel like more of closer to 100% of you can align with your goals, that there's less self-sabotage, that there's a great ability to separate from negative family patterns, that you're more able to connect with what you really inside deeply feel you'd like to do. How am I doing? Questions up till now? So his question was, how could trauma be transmitted to the microbiome? I don't think there's any data on it. I think that in a very non-professional way, what I'm suggesting is that it's not just me that goes to the horrible car accident. There's a horrible car accident. The soul's in the car, the body's in the car, and the microbiome's in the car, and everybody gets injured. Whether or not that happens through a neurological communication of the shock from the brain to the microbiome, or through distortions in the hypothalamus pituitary axis, it's a great question. There is no data on it whatsoever. But I think it's just kind of like, it's a total person that's in the car accident, not just a person that goes through the trauma and then somehow that affects the microbiome. The microbiome was in the car too. And when it's an emotional experience, if I had a father that was dysfunctional and was raging at me but didn't hit me, so there's not a physical trauma, just absolutely raging at me, then in my own sense, the microbiome feels like it's being yelled at too, because it's one unit. And I think the microbiome knows it's one unit far more than we do. Okay, so the question was just asked was, when I did the session with the woman over right eye, did I take on any of that anger? And one of the blessed things about how I work, I don't know how it happens, is I don't take stuff on. I felt it release, and it just was gone. I do lots of other weird things, but I don't take stuff on, thank God. But I do lots of other weird things, but I don't take stuff on. So the question is, how do you know which microbiome is causing the problem? The answer is, unless you're a really magnificent read, you don't know, and you just treat them all. So again, the question was, what do I do if my gift isn't looking at a body and seeing where the trauma is? Does that mean I can't use this technique? And the answer is, the way that it's set up is that you just talk to all the microbiomes. The auditory, the visual, the respiratory, etc. It's a good question. Anybody else? Yes. So her question was, if you didn't hear her statement, is that she has a friend that is going through long-term maintenance chemotherapy, and she actually is experiencing her friend is having a blooming of her life on the maintenance chemotherapy. And what might I think about that? Well, obviously any response I have is pretty much useless, just an intuition. But I would think that it is possible that the chemotherapy, the person might have had a preponderance of incredibly bad microflora that might have been part of her depression, might. Notice I'm just conjecturing. And that perhaps beyond the spiritual experience that sometimes someone can go through, going through cancer, et cetera, perhaps the chemotherapy might be helping her maintain an incredibly bad microbiome, helping it control it and negate it, and she's doing things to try to sustain the good. Is that possible? Sure it is, because anything's possible. The question was, if you get blood transfusions to get someone else's microbiome, what would you guess? Anybody? Yes. Absolutely, because that's how AIDS was transferred when they didn't know about it. Yes, you are picking up on at least aspects of their microbiome. Imagine if you get a heart transplant. Transplants, there's some interesting theory about transplants, how sometimes aspects of the person's personality that was the donor can actually be transferred to the receiver. And could some of that be microflora? I would think so. Yes? So the question was, if you have someone that comes in, let's say that you work with them and you resolve some trauma from 3 generations ago, and the person that's sitting in your office that you've helped with that 3 generation ago trauma, if you help them resolve that trauma, does that actually, that according to this theory here, would transfer to any future generations, but does that transfer backwards? And in my own practice, which is just the weird world of Lee, it rarely does. It rarely transfers backwards. Does it ever? I think sometimes it does. It would tend to transfer more if the already existing generations starts with a Y, younger. The older the person was, the less the chance that it would transfer, in my experience, because that person would be in their own rhythm. But I don't experience, like, that's oftentimes a wish of people that come to me. It's like, I hope this is going to go on my kids, and I can sit there and feel it, and it's just like, I hope so too. I don't think so, but I hope so. That would be great. Fantastic, but you might want to have them work with this too. But that's my experience. Yes.
So off that, so if you influence the family?
So the question was an interesting one. If you worked on your own microbiome, would that tend to change, if you went back into the family environment, would that tend to change the microbiome of the family?
The dog's going around smelling you all.
Well, let's put it this way. I would think that if there were 10 family members and you changed your microbiome, I think 9 would win. I hate to be negative. I don't think that, I think that if I really changed my microbiome, I could walk into the family and that would be part of communicating a different perspective. And that it might help me, for example, go back home. So one of the things that always used to happen to me was that I would go back home, and then for weeks after I came back home, I'd feel like I was acting like my father. Where was I going? And what I'm suggesting is that I think that if you worked with your microbiome, as well as worked on your intrapsychic experience in the same way, you might be able to go back home and then leave the family, go back home for a visit and then come back to your own natural present resonance and feel more yourself in present time. So that as much as changing your own trauma patterns might help you maintain your own energy, your own consciousness, changing your microbiome would help with that too. But whether or not that's going to actually transfer to other members, you see, because it's not just me walking into the house. What's also there? The house. The house. The house has, if it had mold, if it had whatever, just the environment itself is a microbiome. So there's the physical environment of the house itself with its own. This building has its own microbiome. You know that, right? You can't see them, but here they are. So there's almost like a consciousness of the environment itself, and changing one person within that, especially on a temporary visit, and especially if you worked with a child on their microbiome and they had to go back in and they were still being traumatized, I would really question if it would transfer at all. But that's a Lee theory.
So it sounds like working with.
The question was, would intention be a good vehicle to try to help your microbiome maintain its own sanctity when you go back into a toxic environment? So obviously it wouldn't hurt. Obviously it might help a lot, and it might do nothing. I'm just being, and this is Lee speaking, okay? I really want to be real clear. This is Lee speaking. I think that positive thought and intention is really profound and sometimes completely meaningless. Completely meaningless, because I think that it's like when people can call me up that have cancer and go, I want to resolve the trauma so the cancer goes away. And I'm like, going, we're not that simple. It's not just intentionality. It's also physical reality. It's genetics. It's microbiome. It's diet. It's like, it's the experience of being alive on this planet is multidimensional. It's Trump. It's everything. Right? So do I think that intentionality is very powerful? Yes, and sometimes when you work with people that are traumatized that I work with, that worship of intentionality can be their most magnificent source of shame, because since they haven't gotten better, they feel like they're not good people. I guess that's what I really want to say. Sometimes it is enough, and sometimes it's nowhere near enough. And it's not because the person isn't good. Yes.
Is it possible at pondering this and maturity?
The question she was asking is, when you walk into an environment and it feels incredibly toxic, and if you're someone that can work with clearing, what you might be clearing is negative energetics, the emotions of the family. Maybe if you believe in entities, maybe there's entities, and maybe there's also just a toxic microbiome. And if someone was really good at clearing, would they want to perhaps consider that? And I would say yes. Yes. Okay. Anything else before we?
Sometimes I just touch this scar.
Okay. So this is a practitioner, a chiropractor that works with someone that had their entire small intestine removed.
Yes.
So that if the small intestine is the site of absorption of nutrients, and what that means is that all of the nutrients must get in another way, which is through the bloodstream.
Yes, but he eats well. He eats good food.
Okay. So in a situation like that, can you address all the other parts of the microbiome? And I would say emphatically yes. Because the other parts of them, it's like if you look at a lot of the research, they always focus on gut microbiome. They're always and when they say gut, they're typically talking about colon. And there are other magnificent parts of the microbiome. Think about how important the reproductive microbiome must be, because they're there when a woman conceives a child. Part of the environment that we're formed in when conception happens is there's the microflora of the sperm, and there's also the microflora of the entire reproductive system. It's magnificent. There's a microflora of the respiratory tract, which influences our interrelationship with the atmosphere. So I think they're all vital. Yes, so I would say yes, you definitely could. Talk to all of them. So what's the strategy? So we'll go through this and then we'll take the break. What is the strategy? strategy is two things. One, what do you say? Let's just go through that, and then we'll take the break. And how do you guide a client through it? So what do you say? There's basically only 2 sentences in the process. Of course, they're wordy and weird and lee. Sentence number 1, divine microbiome of the blank. What would go in the blank? We'll get to that, but that would be something like colon or respiratory tract. Divine microbiome of the blank. Please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Now, what the heck does that mean? First off, why divine microbiome? And if you have Lyme's disease, I don't think you'd be asking this question right now. Because there are good and bad microorganisms. If you have herpes simplex in your reproductive system, I'm not sure you'd be asking this question. If you're fortunate enough to not have stuff like that, you might go, why use the word divine? What you're talking to me in this process are those where the relationship is mutualistic or at least neutral. The microorganisms that are beneficial, where there's a beneficial relationship potentially between you and them, or at least a neutral relationship. Those that are parasitic and actually would love to just take over, I don't really want to talk to them. Now you might go, why don't you want to talk to them? They already are absorbing their own frequencies of energy. They are very much taking care of themselves. And if they're not, I don't want to tell them how to. If I'm doing some kind of intervention that's knocking them on their butt, I don't want to wake them up. Does that make sense? I'm really trying to talk to the ones where there's a good relationship between them and I, potentially at least. Why, please? This is not an affirmation. This is not an affirmation. I don't want to hear any of you going, colon microbiome. Please, what I want you to do now. Oh. You're trying to befriend these creatures. So how do your friends respond to you when they go, Stan, do this for me now? Stick it, Stan. You're trying to establish a relationship. You're trying to befriend these creatures that for much of your life you've either completely ignored, even though they live in you, or you've actually done things that have tried to annihilate them, maybe unintentionally. Please say please. Ask the core of the earth. Now, for those of you that have come to any of my other classes, you might go, what about the sun? We always ask the sun. I wanted you to know that in the theory of the guy that inspires the work I do, the same level of truth is in the core of the earth as there is in the sun. So the only purpose for having this core of the earth is just to show you one other place that you could talk to. So what is the core of the earth? The earth's core has 2 layers, an outer molten layer and an inner solid core. Who cares? What's interesting is its convection currents within the molten outer core, movement currents within the outer core, is what creates the Earth's magnetic field. Who cares? Does anybody know what would happen if there was no magnetic field on the Earth? We'd all be dead. We would all be dead. Like on Mars, the atmosphere would have what? Blown off. The atmosphere would just be blown off, and there'd be no protection at all from dangerous rays from the sun. So this is an essential part of what keeps us alive on the planet, is this magnetic field generated by the core. And then according to this guy that lived and died in the mid-70s, I never met him, that was written about in the book Born to Heal, he was a profound healer. He could heal cancer, heal Parkinson's, heal schizophrenia, just fix things, which I absolutely cannot do. Absolutely cannot do. His theory was, in essence, if you believed in Akashic records as a term, the Akashic records are in the Earth's magnetic field. They come from the core of the Earth. All information since time began is in the core of the Earth. All knowledge that sustains us is there. It's available to anyone. So that's the reason for asking the core of the earth. Now, what's this last thing? Part of Bill's theory that was really profound was that every creature has their own frequency. So that each one of us in this room has our own individual frequency. It's not like there's just a frequency for human beings and a frequency for sacred datura plants and a frequency for sunflowers and a frequency for cows. No, each cow has its own frequency. And each of us has our own unique frequency. And that's what sustains us, is by taking that in. So then the question still is, why are you talking about this? When a human being is traumatized, he or she starts to disconnect from this fundamental provision by Creator of this infinite supply of everything we need. And so true with Microflora. When Microflora are traumatized, they're walking around like going, and instead of going, where's my frequency, what are they going? Eat! Yeah. They're distorted and looking for fulfillment through anything else that's possible, oftentimes what they think would be beneficial to them based on the conditioning of the family. So the frequencies are there, they just don't know it anymore. So what you're asking the Microflora to do is, hey, ask the core of the earth about how well you're taking in the energy you need that's right there, right now. In other words, you're trying to bring the Microflora into present time, into the fact that they're infinitely provided for, to get them out of trauma vortex. That's what this statement is about. Good flora of the colon, please ask the core of the earth about how well you're taking in that which is you. Is essentially what this is. Because it's there. The blank in the sentence goes through the major parts of the microbiome. The colon, and there's a sheet in the back of the handouts that has the whole technique. It's page 11. You address this to the colon microflora, the flora of the ears, the eyes, the mouth, the respiratory tract, the urinary tract, the reproductive system, and skin and hair. Are there other microbiomes? Most definitely there are. These are the major typical ones. But you might want to add on to that list, depending upon your own physiology. If you've had an ulcer that was caused by a bacterial distortion, then you'd want to add on the stomach microbiome. If you have SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth, you'd probably want to talk to the small intestine microbiome. That phrase paranasal sinus, if you've had lots of sinus infections, you'd probably want to add on the sinus microbiome, or any part of your body that has its own unique microbial history where you had to apply a lot of antibiotics or something, or a lot of steroids. How is that possibly going to work? I'm sorry to say that the microbiome knows that you're talking. It's listened to you for years. And it knows its own name. When you talk to the colon microbiome, it knows, oh, I'm the colon microbiome. It doesn't go, I don't know where I am. Geez, I don't know what this organ is I've been living in for 65 years. I'm just kind of hanging out in this It's like, they're not stupid. I'm a colon microbiome, hey. They're not dumb. And don't belittle them to go, they don't know what's going on. We're dumb when we think they're that way. They know your voice. And if you're a body worker and you put your hands over the person, over their colon or over their eye, then you can talk to it through your hands if the person in the microbiome feels safe. And if you're a parent and your child before puberty, if they're sleeping, you can talk to their microbiome. And if you're a pet owner, you can talk to your dog or cat's microbiome or your snake's microbiome. And if you feel safe, you can even do it to yourself. So, divine microbiome of the colon, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Questions on this statement before we go on to the second sentence? So his question was there something I mentioned earlier that was simpler? If I did, I wasn't aware of it. Oh, could you say, so the questions he's asking, are there simpler ways of saying it? And the answer is, I'm sure there are. Because I was an accounting teacher for 25 years. I have certain kind of structural rules that you do this and this and this and this, and it's, if you can find a way that works, I don't care. Really. So if you find a different way of doing it, the reason for each of these aspects of the statement was, again, to talk to the good guys or girl microbiome, and you're asking them to connect with source about whether or not they're getting what they need. If you can say that in a different way with the same intention, or even if you think of a different way of doing it altogether, great, if it works. Yes? Could you say my colon? Sure. Her question was, can you put my instead of the? Or if you're talking to your child's colon, could you say Susan's colon? Of course. If I'm working on someone, I might say your colon. And I might also just say this to myself. Anybody else have a question on my wordy statement? Yes. So the question that she's asking is, if you have someone with rheumatoid arthritis and you're trying to work on the microbiome of the joints where the rheumatoid arthritis is invading the body, would there be some way of working with all of them at once? And the answer would be yes. It depends upon your theory. If I was to do that and I was a body work, I would work through the pelvis. Because in my system, not because I'm brilliant like Bill was, I just say, since Bill said it, Bill Gray felt like the core of the body is here in the hara. So I would talk there and just say, I'm going to talk to all the joints through here. Most definitely. Yes? If I was to work with blood, I'd put my consciousness or hand, depending upon how I was working, over the heart and talk to the blood as it went through the entire system, and all the blood has to go through the heart. But that's how I would do it. But you could talk to all the blood through there. So the question is, do I always say this out loud, and do I always use my hands? And the answer is, in my office, because I'm trying to do as much as I can for the person as quickly as possible, I typically, many times, just do it myself. And I just put my hands on top of their colon, and I talk to the colon microbiome. There are times where that's completely inappropriate, that the person needs to participate in the process, and then I would have them say the sentence. I usually have them say it out loud because I feel like it's more powerful, and I personally can track the energetics of the process better when they're saying it out loud. But that's just how I work. If someone's doing a process internally, what do I not know? I don't know if they're spacing out and thinking about lunch. Are you with me? It's like if someone's doing an internal process, they very well may be completely online, or they may be going like, oh, I hate my girlfriend. What am I doing here? This is just, they might be thinking about anything other than what we're trying to do. So I can track their intentionality through their words, but that's a lead theory. Okay, let's go to the second sentence. First, each sentence is, you repeat the sentence 6 to 10 times for each component. And here's the sentence 2, then we'll take the break. Divine microbiome of the blank, the same things, colon, etc. Please metabolize. Now, what the heck is this? First, it's the same series of components. And why metabolize? What these creatures are doing is they're taking things and they change things from one form into another. That's what they do chemically, is they take the substance of what's, for example, in your colon and change it into a form that they can actually use to vitalize themselves. And what I'm asking them to do is to continue to do that and do that for my emotional problems. I'm asking them to actually use these chemical processes that they use, and metabolism is taking something from one form and putting it into a more usable form. I'm actually asking them to utilize those exact same processes that they do chemically to feed themselves, to actually process every energetic structure that's involved in my helplessness, fear, whatever, or our helplessness, fear, and change it into a usable form. So I'm actually taking what's natural to the microflora, which is metabolizing. I'm saying I'd like you to also do that on an emotional level. Now, there's a way where that sounds really true. It's like, how's that possible? My own belief system is that your stomach, for example, helps you do what? Digest food. If you were really energetically aligned, which I'm not, but if you were energetically aligned and really your body and being were running a lot of high frequency energy, guess what I think your stomach would be doing all the time? Digesting your life on an energetic level as well as digesting the food you're eating. If you were really energetically aligned, really in rhythm, really connected up to source and whatever you want to say, your reproductive system would not be just setting up a potential for you to create a child, but would also be helping you create new ideas for your life. And in that same sense that I sense and have experienced so many times in my practice, those same kind of things that bodies do, really being designed to also help that happen energetically, I feel like the microflora does exactly the same thing when it's online. So what we're saying is that we're trying to get the microflora out of the trauma trance and then mobilizing them to do what they're meant to do, because this is what they're meant to do. They're not designed to sit there and go, oh, Lee has to process all the emotions, just leave it up to Lee. They're like going, we don't want to be traumatized either. Don't wait for Lee to do it. I want them to be proactive too. Do you get it? I want my microflora to be actively participating in a better life as much as I am. And I feel like the microflora is naturally set up to do this. It doesn't happen because they start to fall in the cultural trance of the culture. How much is this taught? Zero. Never. And in fact, if you walk around and look at most of our bodies are like going, well, I'm along for the ride, but I don't know what I'm doing here. Because we don't think that our bodies are actually designed to do these things. Our bodies are designed to be transmutational vehicles. Whatever they're supposed to do physically, they also do energetically and spiritually. And the microflora to me is exactly the same. Everything, metabolize everything that why the word we? Because it's you and the microbiome that are going through the pattern. Everything we need to learn from. And what this is saying is that if I have a pattern, for example, if I'm going to put the word helplessness in here, I want to take everything that's involved in that pattern, every single part of it, neurophysiologically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. I want to take all of that and transmute it into something useful. All the ooky stuff and blooky stuff, and I want to take everything that's involved in that. All the energy that's distorted, I want to take all that energy that's convoluted and distorted, and I want it all to become magnificent. Take everything in the pattern and make something good out of it. Make it into a resource. In the blank at the end of the sentence, pick something specific. Don't try to solve your whole life. Don't try to solve your whole life. Don't try to solve your whole life. You're trying to just go, let's focus here. Fix everything. Oh, that'll work real well. How well does that work for you? Ideally that it's an emotion versus I'd like you to work on this metaphysical program that I have from, it's like, the microbiome is like going, just shut up and tell us what you want us to do. Be specific, please. You don't need to know why you have the pattern. A lot of times people go, but I don't know why I have the pattern. I don't care. Most of the time when we make up an explanation of why we have the pattern, we are wrong anyway. Because we're all way much dumber than we think. Okay, that was a Lee theory, but just ignore me. Self-included. The reason why I have this pattern is because... Shut up, Lee. Change. Get on with it. Also, please, when you're doing this process, don't try to go, I need to put this in a really positive form. Now, what would be the positive way of expressing helplessness? Shut up, work with the helplessness, get on with it. And it shouldn't be a whole theme. Few words. fear of Trump, fear of whatever. Divine microbe in the ears, please metabolize everything we need to learn from helplessness. If you're doing it for someone else, divine microbe in the mouth, please metabolize everything you need to learn from shyness. Repeat each sentence for each component 6 to 10 times. Repeat steps 1 and 2 as necessary. Okay, this is a good time for a break. So the question was, if someone had a tendency, if someone had a tendency towards headaches, how would you do the process? You just put headaches in the blank at the end of the sentence. So, divine microbiome of the colon, please metabolize everything involved in the headache pattern. Yes. So, the question is about what kind of things can be done physically to address the microbiome, right? So, I actually have a whole section of slides, but it's not necessary to put the slides up. It's one of the things to be really aware of is that you might have a technique or a specific probiotic or a specific diet that worked just like crazy for you, and it might make someone else really, really sick. Part of what's so really problematic about the microbiome is that each of our microbiomes is so incredibly individualized, so that there is a meta-analysis study that said that typically after taking antibiotics, it's a good idea to take probiotics. But then there was another study in Israel that said there are some people that are made worse by probiotics. That it actually makes some people heal slower to take probiotics. So that there's actually 3 kinds of probiotics. And the question, which one of those, if any of those, is right for you? And it's like there are different kinds of prebiotics. There's prebiotics which are actually fibers that you might eat that not so much are useful to you, but are useful as food for the microbiome. There's some of those that speed up the digestive tract and some that slow it. And there was one person I was working with that had horrible, they had C. diff, the terrible bacterial infection that sometimes people can get from being in a hospital. And they'd done a fecal transplant from someone else where they actually took fecal matter, and that's what the technique is. And they'd gotten much better, but their whole system was still virtually in a state of war. So we worked together, and then someone suggested to them that they try this specific great prebiotic fiber. Knocked them right on the floor. All the work that we'd done just got undone. Because that was that specific fiber that we're probably allergic to. So are there a lot of things that might help someone that you could do physically? The answer is yes, but don't be cookbook about it. To really know, it's like if you try something to work with your own microbiome physically, I would just plead with you, if after 2 or 3 days it's still aggravating you, it probably means it's not right. To not go, oh, it's just a healing crisis. Because that's the standard dogma response of a lot of alternative practitioners. It's just to go, oh, it's just a healing crisis, and then you keep using the product and you're inflaming the heck out of your gastrointestinal tract. So I think that there's a lot of data that says that there are a lot of things that you can do for yourself. Prebiotics. There's a lot of data that says that try to minimize your use of antibiotics. A lot of data that says that. Only use it when it's absolutely medically necessary. But sometimes it is necessary. So there's an interesting thing where children that are born by C-section tend to have a less diverse microbiome than children that are born through the birth canal, because of that lack of exposure to the birth canal and the microflora there. So that there are some people that are actually going, maybe what we should do, and there isn't data on this, but I've read about it, where they go, once the baby's born, if it was born by C-section, I might take a swab from the woman's vaginal tract and actually swab it on the child's face to try to mimic the experience that they would have had if they were born vaginally. So lots of things that you could do. They are in the handouts. Just so you know they're there. If you have a reaction to any of these, stop it, because maybe it's not right. I mean that really strongly. But other things that can be done, yeah, there are. For some people that have a magnificently sturdy digestive tract and are very unhypersensitive to things, they could use almost nearly any product and it might help them. And for other people, it's just like, ooh, there's one product. I tried 7 other kinds of probiotics and they all knocked me. And there was one that worked. And unfortunately, some people have a system that's sensitive. I think I know someone real well that has that. Yes?
The second sentence, can you insert intergenerational trauma or is it too broad?
The question was in the second sentence, could you insert intergenerational trauma? And the answer is that's way too broad. Because that could be way more than you think. Yes? What she's saying is that the sac was intact when my child was born. Yes. Does that in any way influence the microbiome? And the answer would be typically it might, right? Because she wasn't going through with her skin physically in contact with your reproductive tract.
Right, and then I split it with my fingernail.
Great. So, but, and again, so I think that could, I'm not saying that's the cause of anything, but that could have experienced her microbiome. And then it's kind of like, it's the darndest thing. It's like, oftentimes, women that come into my office, oftentimes when they have children, do everything that they could to have the best experience possible for their infant. I mean, go 25 yards beyond the finish line to try to do everything. And sometimes stuff just happens. And then again, maybe if you took a swab and put it on the child's face after that, then that might enhance it. I don't know. But in any description of any of this, to me, it's really, unless the mother knowingly took cocaine or whatever, it's just like, typically a lot of the women we work with do everything possible, and there's a lot of shame when anything that happens that's not just the ultimately positive thing for their child. I don't know why I'm saying that, that's just my experience. Yes?
Yes,
So the question was, could we try to mobilize the microbiome to give us more direct information? And my feeling is yes. So that one of the simplistic ways would be to say, if I feel like I'm disconnected from information, I could just put in the blank, metabolize any and all energy in the pattern of disconnected from information. But also, there's a way where the more you turn your microbiome on, the more you bring it out of trauma and the more you mobilize it, the more that you begin to work together and become mutually together receptive to information. And you could also mobilize the microbiome to try to transform any blocks between you and it. Anybody else?
So let's say you get your microbiome really good.
So let's say that, let me transmute that. Let's say that I have a pattern of, which fortunately I don't, but I have lots of other really bad patterns. Let's say I have a pattern of eating Hostess ding-dongs or something like that. Those ugly pink things, whatever they used to be called. Snowballs, yes, that's it. Could I talk to my microbiome and go, I need you to hang in there during this. I need this. This pink stuff. Tell yourself it will help you because I'm hoping it will, but I need it. I think that the whole goal of trauma work is that you as a soul become more resilient and that your microbiome become more resilient. So that inadvertent exposures or inadvertent hostess ho-hos or whatever that you respond and it's just like, yeah, whatever, that happened. So I think that the goal of the process is actually that you become resilient enough that you don't even need to talk to your microbiome, that it knows what's going on and just goes, okay, we're going to deal with this. But hey, Lee, don't keep doing that. So if I know that I'm allergic to wheat and I keep eating it, then eventually the microbiome is going to just let go. It's like, why do I even talk to Lee? If he's going to keep eating this stuff that inflames the living daylights out of the gastrointestinal tract, and he's just going to keep doing it and doing it and doing it because he doesn't like the inconvenience of having to eat something different than everybody else at the restaurant, then the microbiome is going to kind of go like this. Well, if you're going to stick it to me, then I'm going to stick it to you. I think. Because it's like there's a way where it's a mutualistic relationship. To ask it to support you with stressful times is totally logical, but it's asking you to help it with stressful times. Right? It's asking you to back it up. I really mean this. I don't feel like it's asking you in any way to always eat the right thing and just to think positive thoughts and to just eat the perfect foods and just to, this is what the microbiome really wants from me. Oh, the microbiome goes, that's so boring. We can deal with things. Let's be alive. Let's enjoy life. But if you're going to be an idiot, Lee, then that's something else. That was very ex-contemporaneous. Don't believe a word I just said. Okay.
From that question, where the situation that they go back into?
So the question is, what happens when someone leaves the office? The question with any kind of work, whether it be Gestalt work, transpersonal work, Lee work, is always, does the work hold, right? That's always the question, because the only work that's interesting is work that holds. So the question is, will this work hold? And if you worked with their microbiome, if you work with the microbiome of a 7-year-old kid and he went back into the same environment and was still getting the living daylights beat out of him, I'm sorry, this work isn't going to do anything. It's just not. It can't, because the trauma is what? It's ongoing, it's present. But if someone went into, it's like, it's almost like this. So if you have a couple that's living together, they start to share what? Microbiomes. Through touch, through sex, through diet, through everything. It's just life. That's part of what's going on. So there's this whole microbiome, right? Microbiome agreement between the two of them. And if you do work with them on their microbiome in session, then sometimes the person might go home to their partner and they might start to fight. Because of why? Because of the change in the frequency. Because your microbiome is now like going, I don't buy that crap. I'm not passive anymore. I'm here. I'm not in that concussion from age 5. I'm not in that time when Dad was hitting us. I'm here. And that in and of itself might create a momentum towards a positive change in the relationship, or it might split them up. But again, the goal is that there's enough of a change that happens that it actually is substantial enough that it actually lasts, and you can walk into it in any environment, work, home, whatever. But again, if you're presently being traumatized like crazy, I think this work is pretty meaningless. If someone was really being physically violated, I don't want to do this, I want to get them out of the environment.
Have you ever tried working on the bacteria before it enters the body? So like a probiotic bottle, so that you're not introducing bacteria that's already traumatized?
So the question that he's asking is, have I ever worked on like the pills before I take them in? No, I haven't. It's an interesting question. It's totally possible, right? You might be able to raise the frequency of the product before you take it in. No, what you're doing in sentence 2 is in this first blank, first you put colon, then you put ears, then you put eyes, then you put respiratory tract, and you go down the list. What goes here is the pattern you want to change. So you're talking to all the different parts of your microbiome one by one, repeating the sentence 6 to 10 times for each part of the microbiome, and then but this stays the same. If I feel like there's another part of the body that I want to include, then I just add on to the list. I add on stomach. Or if I think something that is generic throughout the whole body, if it's in the bloodstream, I would go to the heart. If it's in the generic nervous system, then you might personally go through the brain because you believe in that, but I would go to the hara. Yes. The hara is this. Bill Gray called this the pelvic brain. All the nerves of the pelvis. All the nerves of the pelvis. Nerves that move muscles, digestive nerves, central nervous system nerves, parasympathetic nerves, sympathetic nerves. Basically what he could do is he could work on you here and affect every single part of the body. He could put his hand down here and change glaucoma by simply changing the energetic of the part of this vehicle here that controls the eyes. But that's how he worked. I can't do that. There was a question, yes? It's a great question. How do you know when the work's done? So that if, so within the context of body work, if you were a body worker, which I know most of you aren't, but if I was a body worker and I was working on someone, I would probably, with my relationship with their body, pick the part of the microbiome that I felt like was the most traumatized, and I just repeat sentence 1 with it, maybe for 15, 20 minutes, and stay with that until it came boom on. And if you work with bodies, you'd probably develop a sense where you can feel that. As far as approaching it more from a counseling level, how do you know when this has worked? When the pattern's changed. So when a lot of people were nice enough to volunteer, and I kept on asking because I wasn't clear in my request. It was my mistake. I was looking for someone that has a specific emotion that they're feeling, that's a troublesome emotion in their life. And I said, I need you to be able to feel it. Can you feel it? And one person said, yeah, I can feel it. I can bring up this anxiety just like this. Well, no, because we're going to work with that emotion, and if it changes, she'll notice it, because then she won't be able to call it up anymore. So that when you're working emotionally, what the goal is that the emotion, typically when you work with emotions from a somatic or body perspective, what happens is that the emotion starts to drift away from the person. So they go, I can still sense it, but I have more distance from it. Does this make sense? So it's like, instead of the emotion sitting right in here, it's like it's here. And it's, instead of being like a 10, it's like it's a 5. And then it's out here, and it's a 3, and then it's gone. So that's the assessment is, the goal is to have what? Less distress. The goal is to have more choice. The goal in any kind of trauma work is to have more choice as far as what you feel and how you do and act in your life. So that's a good question. Anybody else? Let's move on. So how do you guide a client through it? To me, if I was to do this verbally, if I'm doing body work, I would just, I have the person's permission, I might say I'm going to work with the microbiome of your colon, and I just start to work with it. But if you're working in a more of a counseling environment, then it's appropriate to help the person understand what the heck's going on. We're working with your microbiome, and what is that? That's all the microorganisms on and in your body. And there's more cells of that than there are cells of your body. What do? They help you digest foods, break down toxins, produce vitamins and minerals you wouldn't have otherwise, fight bad bacteria, and there's data that shows that they're traumatized just like you are. There's lots of studies that say that the microbiome influences how we think and feel. There's a lot of data. It's not the cause, but it is important. And what this process is about is freeing the microbiome of trauma, getting it to be in present time, strengthening your relationship with the trauma, with the microbiome. I mean, I want to have an intimate relationship with my trauma. That's a great idea. I believe in toxicity. Okay. And mobilize it. So to bring it into present time and to mobilize it. You don't need to know the organisms of the microbiome at all. All you need to do is repeat the sentences. If you come up with an emotion during the process, the goal is not to dive in. The goal is to go, I'm feeling fear, and I'm going to continue the process, because the goal is to feel better. You can take a break whenever you want, and you might feel tingling, you might feel relief, you might feel, very commonly, if you're doing the process verbally, the person will start to stumble on the words when it starts to work. So the person's saying the words and they start to go, that's because they're contacting the trauma. It's not because they're getting dumb, it's actually starting to work. So mumble as much as you can to make it work. No. Your job, if you're guiding someone through it, be compassionate, be present, help the person change between the sentences, help the person not do affirmations with their microbiome. I mean it, because the microbiome will just go, another idiot. Trying to command the whole word through their brain, geez. Help the client stay with the process versus dive in. If the person never went into a reenactment, the chance of going into a reenactment doing this process is about negative 85 trillion. Because you're talking your microbiome, it's hard to go into, well, I had this past life. But if someone did, you'd bring them back into present reality by having them focus on, notice the sensation of your hands on the chair, notice the color of my eyes, notice what time it is, current sensory reality. When someone goes into a reenactment, you do not want to ask them what they feel. You want to ask them what they sense. That's what brings them back. At the end of the session, do cross crawl and self-worth, which are simple brain gym exercises. This is cross crawl. And this is self-worth. Just to get the body to limber up and integrate the change. Okay, I'd like to do the demo. This is Mary, and she was nice enough to volunteer. Thank you for coming up, Mary. What emotion would you like to pick that you can actually feel that you'd like to have less of? Try again.
Anxiety.
Hey, yeah,
and worry.
okay, we hear you. Say it loud. When you feel the anxiety, does it show up anywhere particular in your body, or is it just a generalized feeling?
It goes through my body. I feel it most particularly in my stomach, and it can make my head kind of feel like it's blanking out.
Okay. And is it easy to tune into?
Yes.
Just tune into it for like 5 seconds. And where was that in your body?
In my tummy more.
Great. And on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being as bad as it ever gets in your life, what was that? Like a 4 or 5 or something? Or?
Yeah, about medium.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Someone that has this kind of access, like Mary does, is a blessing for anybody that does EMDR, brain spotting, any kind of work like I do, because it means that they're very kinesthetically aware, it can bring up their feelings, so it's easy to track if the work helps or not. Not everybody can do this. To me, she can't do this because she's more evolved, and she can do this easily not because she's less evolved. It's just how some people are set up to just be able to go like this. And some people go, can you feel the emotion? They go, are you kidding me? I don't have a clue. But it's an emotion that haunts them. So that's when I was asking for a volunteer, I was basically looking for someone like Mary that had good access, and we can actually get some feedback from her if the work's working. Is there any part of your microbiome, any part of your body where you've had lots of infections or any systematic problems before in your life? Or are you free of that?
Really throughout my body. A lot in my stomach, my sinuses and ears. But it seems like there's been an ongoing infection for many, many years.
Have you had to take antibiotics meds?
I've taken many antibiotics.
Okay. So this is a great person to do this with. Are you currently taking antibiotics?
No.
Thank you. Hey, let's give this a try. Okay, here's the... So all I want you to do, and I'll guide you through it, is to put each word in the blank. I'll tell you when to stop saying the sentence and to move on to the next. So we're on page 11, and yes.
Divine microbiome of the colon, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the colon, please ask the core of the earth about the absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the colon, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the colon, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the colon, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the colon, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the colon, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the colon, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your frequencies of energy.
You're doing really good, Mary. Just keep going.
Divine microbiome of the colon, please ask the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy.
Doing great. Doing really good.
Divine microbiome of the colon, please ask the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the colon, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy.
Great job. Next. You're doing really good.
Divine microbiome of the ears, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the ears, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the ears, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the ears, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy.
Next, eyes.
Dear microbiome of the eyes, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiomes of the eyes, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the eyes, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the eyes, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the eyes, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the eyes, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy.
Next.
Divine microbiome of the mouth, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the mouth, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy.
Why don't you go on to the next one, respiratory tract.
Divine microbiome of the respiratory tract, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the respiratory tract, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the respiratory tract, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy.
Great. Next, urinary tract.
Divine microbiome of the urinary tract, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the urinary tract, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy.
Good job.
Divine microbiome of the urinary tract, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the urinary tract, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy.
Great. Next, reproductive system.
Divine microbiome of the reproductive system, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the reproductive system, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the reproductive system, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the reproductive system, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the reproductive system, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the reproductive system, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy.
Why don't you skip the next one, just in the interest of time, and put sinuses into the blank.
Divine microbiome of the sinuses, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the sinuses,
Yes.
please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Dear microbiome of the sinuses, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the sinuses, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the sinuses, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the sinuses, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy.
Are there any of those, Mary, that you feel like you need to repeat before we go on to step 2, or does that feel... Doesn't have to be. I'm just trying to honor if you feel something incomplete.
It feels like my throat.
Your throat.
Yeah.
Let's just put throat in.
Divine microbiome of the throat, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the throat, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy.
Great job.
Divine microbiome of the throat, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy.
Good job. Why don't you turn the page? So do you want to call the pattern just fear, or fear and anxiety? What would be the best wording for you to put at the blank at the end?
I think fear, ultimately.
Okay, let's just use fear. Can you keep your feet flat for me? Thanks. So, divine microbiome of the colon.
Divine microbiome of the colon, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the colon, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the colon, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the colon, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the colon, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the colon, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the colon, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the colon, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear.
And change to ears.
Divine microbiome of the ears, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the ears, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the ears, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the ears, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the ears, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear.
Great job. Eyes.
Divine microbiome of the eyes, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the eyes, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the eyes, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the eyes, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the eyes, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the eyes, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear.
Great. Next.
Divine microbiome of the mouth, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the mouth, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the mouth, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the mouth, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear.
Great. Next.
Divine microbiome of the respiratory tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the respiratory tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the respiratory tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the respiratory tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the respiratory tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear.
Doing great. Keep going.
Divine microbiome of the respiratory tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the respiratory tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear.
You're doing really great. Keep going.
Divine microbiome of the respiratory tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear.
Good job. Go on to the next one.
Divine microbiome of the urinary tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the urinary tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the urinary tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the urinary tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the urinary tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the urinary tract, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear.
Great. Reproductive system.
Divine microbiome of the reproductive system, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the reproductive system, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the reproductive system, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear.
Why don't you do throat next?
Divine microbiome of the throat, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the throat, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the throat, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the throat, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the throat, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the throat, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the throat, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear.
Doing great.
Divine microbiome of the throat, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the throat, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear.
And then try sinuses.
Divine microbiome of the sinuses, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the sinuses, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the sinuses, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the sinuses, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the sinuses, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the sinuses, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the sinuses, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the sinuses, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear.
Okay, great. Let you pause for a minute. What are you noticing at this moment in your body?
It feels like kind of more energy on the right side of my body, particularly in my mid-back spine. I started feeling almost a little trance-like even after I talked to you and went to sit down, kind of like I was going into meditation.
Yeah.
So it just feels like things are wanting to move, like this is feeling like it wants to move and up into my heart.
Yeah.
Too.
If you check out the fear now, because we've only done one cycle, how's the fear now? Would you be willing to check that out just for 5 seconds like we did before?
Yeah, I would say it's like a 4. It feels like this feeling of I want to move.
Yes. Good tracking. Would you like to repeat either steps 1 or 2? Did either of them feel more helpful than the other, or? Because it's also fine to stop here.
They both felt
Yeah.
felt good. Yeah. Yeah. Clearly just, what was happening with my voice, and, you could see what was happening. Things were happening internally through emotion and stuff. I could feel things are, wanting to shift and
Yes.
move.
Is there any one of the parts of the body that felt like it most you'd like to do before we finish, or does this feel like a good place? Because the process is not finished, but just because of the fact that it's a workshop. But if this wasn't, we would just do more. But is there any part that you feel like you really would want to do at this moment just to complete?
Well, my attention's coming here right now.
Okay. Would you want to try divine microbiome of the blood, or?
I would love to try that.
Okay. Why don't you try the first sentence with that?
Divine, on step 2 or
Step 1.
Divine microbiome of the blood, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the blood, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the blood, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the blood, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the blood, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the blood, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy. Divine microbiome of the blood, please ask the core of the earth about your absorption of your own frequencies of energy.
Why don't you switch the sentence too? That was great. Yeah.
Divine microbiome of the blood, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the blood, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the blood, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the blood, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the blood, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the blood, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the blood, please metabolize everything we need to learn from fear. Divine microbiome of the blood, please metabolize
Good job.
we need to learn from fear.
Good job. Why don't you stand up for me, and then we'll just do some brain gym. So why don't you stand here? So what you do is you just put one leg up and you touch it with your opposite hand. She did great. Then the other one, Mary, is where you clasp your hands like this. Then you draw a figure 8. Going forward in front of you, like out in front. So you're doing it sideways, which is cool, but to go out like this. There you go. And then behind you. Then you fall backwards like me. And there you go. Good job. Thank you so much for volunteering.
Thank you so much.
So just so you all know, if that was in my office, we wouldn't have stopped there. That was the way that it felt to me, and I don't trust my own perception, I would trust Mary's, is that what was beginning to happen was that there was a healing of the relationship between her and her microbiome. It was almost palpable. Like the way that it felt to me, and again, I'm biased, was that her microbiome was going, you care? You care. And it was just like this sweeping feeling of just like, here's a possibility. So that I feel like if Mary were to do this on her own or were to come in once or whatever, that this could wouldn't fix everything, but it could make a really significant shift. A really big shift. Because what you could feel somatically sitting next to her was both of her and the microbiome have gone through a lot, and what's happened in the process of going through that and with everything else is that the relationship between her and microbiome has gotten like this, which creates a sense of separation, not only between the microbiome and you, but a sense of separation from you and other people, and from God or Goddess. Anybody want to ask a question about what happened, or? Yes?
Why you had her do it instead of you doing it to her? What, other than showing up?
The reason why I had her say it was because that's the way I wanted to do it in the group, because most people in the room are counselors. They're not nutty people like me. They would just go. But that's the reason. If I was in the office, I probably would have put my hands on the back of her heart and talked to the microbiome of her heart for probably like 20 minutes. And just sat there and just helped for a relationship. And it probably would have spread throughout the whole body. Because of the heart's feeding into where? Everything. But that's from a bodywork perspective.
I noticed that sometimes you get many more repetitions than others.
Yes, for example, I skipped the skin and hair because our time constraints, and I could feel that there was, nothing there. It was just like, I could waste time and make sure that I do it just right, so what's on the paper, but it was just nothing there. And then when there was energy there, I tried to hang out with it as long as we could, given the time constraints, but it was only based on trying to track how much energy was moving for a given part, why we did it more with one or the other. The real goal, to me, well, I don't want to say that because of something that happened last night where Ursula helped me with something that was unbelievable, where the microbiome transformed this fear that I was in. It was almost profound. But the minimalistic goal of the process is to get your microbiome out of trauma. That really, that's like baseline, because if you really do that, then it just creates a platform of flexibility throughout your whole life. So that the idea of having to do this process, step 1 and 2, step 1 and 2, step 1 and 2, a lot of times you might just focus on step 1 and just do step 1 and that's enough. But there are times where if your microbiome's been hammered with 4 years of tetracycline for pimples, that you might not only need to bring the microbiome out of trauma, but to actually wake them up in terms of being able to realize what their potential is. There was another question, yes. She's asking, can you change the word the to my? It's totally fine. Totally fine, whatever feels more comfortable. What I was saying was that when someone feels like they have a condition like rheumatoid arthritis where there's inflammation in all the joints, clearly you can't go and talk to this joint and this joint. That's just, so that if I was to be having someone talk to this or put my hands on the back of their sacrum, for example, if they were lying on a table, then what I'm saying is that you could actually put your hand there or talk to that and go, I'm talking to all the joints of my body, because this is the home of my whole body. So I'm divine microbiome of all the joints, and address it to here would be my system. Divine microbiome of all of the tendons, if I had a tendon problem.
Would it be helpful if someone is dying?
That's a great question. So the question was, if someone was dying with this, might this ever be helpful? I can't imagine that it wouldn't support the process of separation when separation was what was really next. That the microbiome doesn't want you to hang on. It doesn't want you to leave either. But when it's right, it's like going like, go. So that if you mobilize one of the things that might come out of a trauma translate of the microbiome is the person might, I'm not being simplistic in saying this is the cause, might cycle in just hanging on longer and longer and longer in a useless state, right? Because the whole vehicle's in a trauma vortex of disassociation. Not just the being, but also the microbiome and body are so disorganized that there's just this perpetuation of just like, well, we don't know what's next because we're all so disconnected from each other. So that I might think personally, I've never done this, I'm just conjecturing, that actually strengthening the relationship between the microbiome and you could really facilitate or at least support departing when that was what was next. Yes? Yes, so the question was, if you go through a process like this and it really works, might you feel tired or toxic for a day or two as things are shifting? And the answer is yes. As you might with a good session of counseling. A really good counseling session might go right through and not only address the cognitive behavioral patterns, but also might address the microbiome indirectly, and the person actually feels kind of like for a couple of days is like, whoa, I was really tired for a few days. So I think any kind of process could actually create sensations of die-off or adjustment as the body reorganizes to a new level of agreement. Yeah, for sure. I was just trying to give people feedback about what I was noticing. That her actual, this is the way I would put it. 1, don't believe me because I'm a nut. But 2, if I'm in any way accurate, then even if we just stopped here, Mary's ability to go into really heightened levels of anxiety is already less. Because every time I was going like this, I was like going, her body's starting to de-escalate. Her body from a autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, is actually coming out of freezing and is becoming more vital. So every time I was going like this, I'm like going, something's shifting here, so that she was able to call up just about the same level of fear, and I completely agree that she was able to do that. And my guess is that if she went out into her life and she went into a bad situation, it would be less than it would have been otherwise. because she's already, even though we only did this once, her microbiome is already like going, whoa, we have a relationship.
Also, is there any microbiome?
So her question was a good one. Would there be any value in going like this when you're talking to the microbiome of the ears, or going like this with the eyes? For some people, that might make it much more effective. For other people, it might not do anything. But if you're drawn to do that, I think it sounds great. Anybody else? Yes?
You said at one point, what's the,
I think that I said something, and I think I must have not stated it well. Would this process work with someone that has Lyme's? Everybody? Yes, yes, yes. What I'm saying is that I wouldn't be trying to talk to the Lyme's with this process. But might this actually help you with the Lyme's? Yes, because you might mobilize the other microorganisms to be able to step up more in a way that actually supports down-regulating the Lyme's. So again, I want to be real clear. All I was saying is that if someone's on antibiotics, that might make this harder for this process to work, because a lot of your microflora is what? Bacteria. And if you're taking an antibacterial, the bacteria of your body that are good are like going like this, trying to fight like crazy to stay alive while you're going through this necessary therapy. But if someone, for example, has Lyme's or herpes, this process, for example, if someone has a tendency, I'm not saying this is what would happen, but if someone tended to have a herpes outbreak once every X weeks or something like that in their reproductive system, if this process really worked, and maybe it doesn't for most people, whatever, but if it worked, then the person would actually have what? Fewer incidences. Because the rest of the microbiome would be trying to take hold and go, no, we can actually hold integrity more. We're actually able to hold more of a relationship of integrity here and keep the herpes more at bay. Is this a cure for herpes? Of course it's not. But it might support the other microflora having more of a footing and relationship to it. Does that make sense? But please don't think I'm in any way promoting this as a cure for herpes, because obviously it isn't. But it might upregulate the rest of the body to relate to it more effectively. Yes, one more question.
is there, the order that you do it, that you start with colon, is there a reason for that?
Is there a reason for the ordering of the things on the list? I put colon first because that's where most of your microbiome is by number. Other than that, if you notice it, it's just going down the body. So there is no spiritual reason behind it at all. The only reason for colon first is that because the colon, I do not feel like the colon is the most important microbiome, but it is by population by far the greatest. So if it's kind of like, you'd like that to be online in some ways more than anything. If you could get just one, you'd want that. The question was, what kind of cues was I noticing she was shifting? And if you noticed, every time when I went like this, she was either getting more emotional or less emotional, that she might be stumbling on the words, or her breathing changed. Also, it was just a somatic sense, and this is all just my subjective experience. Again, what I sensed the most was when I actually feel like what happened a lot for Mary was that there was a meeting of her and her microbiome. That there was a level, it's like, oh, wow, it's us. Which through, notice my language, no fault of hers hadn't been happening. And now it's like, the microbiome is actually like going, can we do this more? Because it'd be nice to be buddies. Yes? If I was doing this on my own, the key thing that I would say is that on a linear level, without having any information about a specific person, the more that you've gone through physical trauma or have had to take a lot of medication, or if you feel like you're doing a lot of kinds of therapy that aren't working, this would be feedback that you might want to try this, right? And how long do you do this if you try it? If you do it for like, some people go, if I do it for 5 minutes, will that help? Probably not. Probably not. Because if this was to really, because again, my sense is that this could be really strongly supportive of, not fix everything at all, but could really strongly support Mary and her spiritual unfoldment. Again, if she just did those sentences for even like for an hour total, that would be enough to That's a lasting change in it of itself. If she did it more, then it would help more. Would she have to do that all at once? No, but typically it's far better to do something like 20 minutes, 25 minutes twice or 3 times versus to do 2 minutes. Because 2 minutes, the microbiome starts to go, you're talking to me, and then you stop talking, and it goes, oh, well, he's not really talking to me. You're talking to me? No, you're not really talking to me. Don't do this while you're driving either, please. Talking to me? Crash. Idiot, why were you talking to me? I would basically, if I was doing this on myself for an hour, you start to get a sense of which parts of your microbiome are most offline. And you literally just sit there and talk with them until you feel like you didn't need to do it anymore. But that's how I would do it. Okay. Yes. Yes, so the question was, would I actually feel willing to violate the order tremendously? Yes. I would. It's like with the person that I did the eye thing with, guess what I did before that? Nothing. I just saw that her right eye was just like going, I want to kill somebody, and I went, that's interesting. And I hung out with that. I want to be real clear though, because of, please don't in any way assume that because I was trying to read things here to make it more time efficient, that you have to be able to read the body like step down like I do or better than I do or what. It's just like, that's a gift that I have. If you just went through the process and did it sentence by sentence, and then the question is, Lee, why didn't you do it that way? Because the time constraint. It would work. That's what I've done in the office. It works. So just be aware that you don't have to have a sense of things. It's just doing the process in and of itself, the process works. Because what is it about? It's about relationship. And I would imagine, I don't think I'd be exaggerating, that probably for half of us in the room, at least half of us, there's probably a significant distortion between us and our microbiomes. Just given what you've had to go through medically, can't you just imagine that that's true? I'm not saying for everybody. I hope it's not true for you, but it's just like for probably at least half the people, I could probably stand in front of you and go, yeah, I think oh, yeah. No, you don't really know. Oh, yeah. It's just part of life on the planet. It's part of life on the planet. It's part of growing up in a toxic family environment that our microbiome might look a lot like our violent drunk father. You know what that is? That's incredibly uninteresting. It's incredibly uninteresting for my microbiome to be in any way responding to life like my father did if he was an angry son of a gun. I want my microbiome to respond to life in congruence with who we are in present time. And if you don't think that microbiomes can be in a trauma trance from the family, oh boy, I think you're missing it. We're much more complex. It's not just what we think. It's who we are alchemically, who we are neurologically, and who we are as a cooperative relationship between us and our microbiomes. It's a relationship. That scientific term of that we're a biomolecular network, it's real. It's happening, whether or not you want to pay attention to it or not. And I'm not saying this should become the focus of your practice. I'm not saying you should ever do this again. But at least be aware that this is real. You are a relationship between a body, a soul, and a microbiome. And it is happening whether or not you ever want to pay attention to it. It's a part of who you are in your experience. And if you have to take antibiotics, then take them. But then consider doing something that helps them rebound. And not be going like, geez, I wonder why I feel so bad. Microbiota is part of us. We are intricately interrelated with it. It's on this piano. It's in the air you're breathing right now. When you pick up the water, even if it's sterilized, it's in there. It's everywhere. It's in the food. It's everywhere. When you touch hands with someone, don't get OCD about it. Just go, that's part of it. Because remember, the data says that if you don't have any microbes, what? You're worse off. So this is not about being OCD. Microbiota is part of families, just like trauma is. Please release the idea of thinking that it's just your life and you as a soul. It's also things that have been happening for a long time. Freeing your mind to not think of trauma just as yours from your life allows trauma to what? Change more. Because if you hold the frame that trauma is just from your life and it's not, that restricts its ability to change. Don't you dare believe otherwise. If you think it's just about me and what's happened since my awareness developed, then you're fooling yourself and you're limiting your whole physiology and conscious ability to change. Trauma could come from anywhere, and I don't care where it comes from. I just want it to change. There's a lot of data that says microflora affects us and that we affect it. I haven't said that, but we affect it as much as it affects us. It affects our brain and our emotions. This is a quote from John Cryan, that fabulous guy in Ireland. What I've really come to understand is that there's no limit on what aspects of emotions might be modulated by the microbiome. This is one of the best researchers in the world. There's no limit to what aspect of our emotions might be affected by this. And another brilliant researcher, Martin Blaser from New York University, there's basically evidence that the microbiome probably touches every aspect of our lives. All aspects of health and disease. Not that it is the factor, but a factor. Your microbiome has been with you and your family for a long time. Properly supported, it can become part of a process that helps you unwind your trauma. It can be part of what helps you realize your potential as a being. Please hug your microbiome. Have a great day. Thanks so much for coming.